Aloha, and welcome to another video for IT 426 at Brigham Young University, Hawaii. In this video, we're going to look at using multiple roles either on a single server machine or distributed across multiple server machines. So let's look at these in turn. Okay. So here on the board, I have an example of this is a server. And servers tend to be very powerful pieces of equipment. And on a given server, you may have the processing capability and the hard drive space and the memory to support more than one role. And if you're a small business, particularly, this may make a lot of sense because you may not have the money to be able to support purchasing an individual machine for your web server and another machine for managing your printers and another machine for managing your files. Okay, so you just put all of these roles on a single machine. And that makes a lot of sense. You're utilizing your hardware more efficiently. Okay? And that can save you money. However, there are a number of advantages to distributing these multiple roles across different servers. And you'll have to look at the environment you're working in, particularly the network environment and the business environment, and what applications are being used to see which of these advantages applies to your situations. So let's look at these. Okay. So I've put together a bit of an acronym so that we can support or to help you remember these 7 items in the future. Okay. This is a hint. You may be asked to explain these in a coming assignment or assessment. Okay. So the acronym I put together is FAR SUNS. Okay. Think of you look up in the sky at night, and there's a number of stars up there, and each of those stars could be called a sun, so you have FAR SUNS. Okay? That stands for fault tolerance, availability, resource allocation, security, update management, network traffic, and scalability. Okay? So let's talk about fault tolerance. Okay? The idea here is that when you're using a single server, then you have one point of failure. Okay? Something happens to that device, either the power supply gets removed or a piece damages, something malfunctions, everything's gone. So in the example I had earlier, where you have a DHCP server and an Active Directory server and maybe a print server or a web server all on one machine, when that machine goes down, everything goes down with it. So in terms of fault tolerance, it makes more sense to distribute the services across multiple machines. Okay, this goes back to there's an old English saying that says don't put all of your eggs in one basket, because if you drop the basket you lose all of your eggs. So similarly, if we have one single machine, then there's a fault tolerance issue. Next, we have availability. Okay, so if we can distribute these roles, we can get higher availability on the network. Okay, so that means that you can have multiple machines providing, say, infrastructure roles to support maybe a web server. So you want a maximum availability. This is kind of related to fault tolerance, but you can simply have the infrastructure services you need made available on one machine within a given role, and then the main service is provided on a different machine. Okay, then we have resource allocation. Okay, so what this means is that the demand for these different resources may fluctuate over time. It may go up, it may go down. For example, you may have lots of web traffic during a certain time of day when your customers either get home from work, or maybe it's a business-to-business server, and so they're ordering during heavy times. Okay, so if you have cyclical demand for certain services that tend to spike at certain times of day or certain times of the week or year, then those peaks in demand may affect the availability of the other resources. So you don't want the individuals on your network not able to access the Active Directory resources if there's all of a sudden a huge spike in demand for your web server because of the time of day or whatever. So allocating resources in that sense means making sure that the demand can be met over time and not just on an average basis. Okay, and we don't want things to become what's called a bottleneck for the performance of other server roles. So that's fault tolerance, availability, and resource allocation. Next, we come to security. And security uh, is related to fault tolerance because we have a single point of failure for fault tolerance, and if we have a single point of failure for security, that means that vulnerabilities in one server role can actually spill over. Okay, so you don't necessarily want your web server, which is publicly facing, accessible by the general public and susceptible to hackers and things, to also be the location of maybe your database server or your Active Directory server. Because if they can break into one, that may exploit a vulnerability uh, to other services that are running, utilizing the same memory, utilizing the same hard drives volume, and so forth on the server. So for security purposes, it also makes sense to distribute these roles. Okay, next we have update management. The more roles you put on a single machine, the more updates need to be downloaded to that machine. And so managing those updates and pushing those out across the network, getting updates installed, you may have to restart your machine when you install a patch or an update for those particular services. And the more service roles that you have on your machine, the more times you're restarting it, the more space is required for updates, the more network traffic to that device is being utilized. So for update management, it makes a lot of sense to distribute these roles across multiple computers. Okay. Next, we have network traffic. Network traffic gets involved here because if we, um, it kind of goes back to our discussion on resource allocation. So if we have a lot of roles that are very network intensive, say for example you've got the database server and the Active Directory server and um, maybe the DNS server are all on one machine, then there's a lot of network traffic coming to that subnet on the network. And so to optimize our network performance, we may want to distribute the roles onto different subnets and therefore on different devices. Okay? And lastly, we have scalability. Okay? So if we need to, if we have peaks in demand for certain resources and we need to allocate more resources as needed, if we've got a single machine that has all of the roles or multiple roles on it, it's difficult to distribute the services that way. So, for example, if we want faster performance, we could have multiple web servers, and then one machine is handling a bunch of traffic, and then we can fork off some of the other traffic so that the demand on a single server is not as great. It's not reaching 100% capacity all the time. So all of this kind of boils down to a couple of main principles. One, when you put all of your roles on one server, you're setting yourself up for a single point of failure. So anything, whether it's related to the availability of your services or whether it's related to the security of those roles and those services or the scalability, if we have it all on one, then during normal conditions, it may not be a problem. But as conditions increase, whether over the long term we're trying to scale up our resources or whether it's because of peaks in demand for certain services, we don't have as much wiggle room. We don't have as much slack resources, we call them, that we can employ in those times. So by distributing things, then we have extra resources that can be utilized. The drawback to distributing, as I've mentioned before, is that it costs more to buy the hardware and to maintain the hardware. So one way of balancing out these trade-offs, depending on the hardware configuration and the capacity of the hardware that you have in your network, is to use virtual machines. In this way, instead of assigning all of these roles to an individual machine on a specific piece of hardware, you're actually creating images of software-based machines. So one device, one server um, box can actually be host to multiple operating systems, and thereby you can kind of reduce the security vulnerabilities because they're not sharing hard drive space. They're not, as far as the computer is concerned, the same device. Now, you may still have issues with network traffic and some of those other issues, and you still have a single point of failure in terms of if the device goes down, then you've lost multiple machines. But some of these other advantages can be brought over um, by using virtual machines. And we'll talk a lot more about terminal services and virtual machines later on in the course. So that's our brief introduction to trying to figure out the trade-offs between consolidating, grouping all of your server roles on a single machine or multiple roles on a single machine to maximize your hardware investment versus the advantages of distributing these roles across the network. Thank you for watching this video. I look forward to your feedback. Mahalo.